Welcome to the O Show, your number one podcast for everything training, mindset, and nutrition. I am your host, Oren McCarry, and it is my goal to help you access the best information around to allow you to kick ass in the gym, in the kitchen, and most importantly, in your head. Between my own experiences and those of my amazing guests, I'm confident we will do that. So let's strap in and level up your life starting right now. That's new.
That's new.
Say what the fuck?
Okay, that kind of put me off, but let's just start. I'm not going to edit that out. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys. Welcome to today's episode of the O Show. I've got two guests on who are repeat guests who don't need no introduction. I have Big Dean McKillop and Joe. So let's start with Dean. Dean, how's your week been, mate? How are you?
I'm well. I think you should start to call me progressively getting smaller, Dean, though. Because the man that's currently below me, at least on my screen in this three-way conversation, is just pulling food away, making me skinny. No, he's not. We haven't even touched our food really, but mate, I'm well. Nothing's really new. Pretty much in the most repetitive state of training and work and life as you could be in right now. It's good.
Yep,
same day, repeat, do it again.
Nice. That's good, man. That's the way a prep should be at this stage, though, right?
Yeah, I like a routine, man. It serves me well in all facets of life, to be perfectly honest.
Yep. So as you mentioned, Joe is your coach, and Joe's been on the podcast, kicked off season 2 actually with the birth control episode. Mr. Joe Jeffery, how are you today?
Yeah, not too bad, man. It's quite early. Well, it's not really early where I am. Early compared to these boys. Are you two in a different time zone?
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm on the West Coast, which is 2 hours behind Dean on the East Coast.
Yeah, I can't get used to this. I said to you before, I talk to, like, some mornings I'll talk to 3 or 4 Australian clients, and it'll be like, good evening. And they'll be like, oh, it's 2 o'clock. I'm like, what? I can't get used to different time zones. But anyway, yeah, I'm cool. Nothing new here.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. Well, this is, guys, this is one that we kind of spoke about on previous episodes. I think me and Joe mentioned it on the birth control episode, and then the next episode, Dean was on with Rich, and we talked about doing a roundtable, and a few people messaged me saying, oh, I'm 100% for this. And it's the first time we've talked about this subject on the O Show, and it took us 2 seasons to get there, but we've probably got 2 of the best people, in my opinion, to actually talk about this in Dean and Joe. So I'm looking forward to this one, guys. So today, guys, we're talking, if you haven't guessed from the title, performance-enhancing drugs. We're going to go through what are performance-enhancing drugs, the best way to use them if you're going to put them in for your physique goals, some fact and fiction on drugs, and just some general Q&A as well. So, Joe, let's start off with you, buddy, because you're top left of my screen, so my eyes just drew to you there. What are performance-enhancing drugs? Because it's quite a big category.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to Wikipedia the exact definition. Drug. I mean, this is a pretty good topic because there's definitely some personal opinion around what you would define as a performance-enhancing drug. Me and Dean had this talk on OPD. The OPD that's just come out is like there's many people that wouldn't consider something like yohimbine HCl a performance-enhancing drug. Excuse me, I'm chewing on a nicotine gum here. That could be a performance-enhancing drug as well. So, you know, something like nicotine, that's an alpha 2 adrenergic receptor antagonist. This, to me, in my mind, it has a specific mechanism of action that isn't available without the use of an exogenous molecule. I would consider that to be a performance-enhancing drug. Many natural federations don't. I guess I would have to deem this as something that's not. How would I deem this? This is a good question. Performance-enhancing drug, use of any exogenous molecule that gives you a performance or hypertrophy or fat loss benefit specific to bodybuilding. That's where my speciality is. I make no illusions that I know anything about performance sports. I'm definitely not sufficiently knowledgeable in those areas to talk on a podcast about them. So with respect to physique goals, we are talking sometimes about neurological inputs for performance in the gym. We're talking about things that drive protein accretion to gain new muscle tissue. And we're talking about things that either turn up lipolysis, so your ability to mobilize and oxidize fat, so to lose fat, and things that turn up or even turn down lipogenesis, your ability to gain fat.
Yep. Dean, if you got anything to add on that description?
No, well, I think the basic definition of a drug is as simple as like anything that affects you physiologically or psychologically that isn't water or something else. There's one other thing I think they put in it. So like this is why people will claim sugar's a drug, which is hilarious. But maybe we could change it to performance enhancing agents, and that might shift the conversation away from this idea that drugs have to be this particular thing, but as opposed to an agent can be really anything that, like Joe said, either drives up any of those factors of in this instance, like physique enhancement that you can't get naturally. The problem though is caffeine's one of them.
Yeah.
You know, and you can obviously still use caffeine for like appetite regulation in a natural bodybuilder, and that's deemed to be legal. So yeah, there's this long piece of string that you can pull on. The question is where you then sit on that string, and whether or not you deem something to be illegal or legal. And that's really the definition of the difference between what we would use in, say, like an untested federation versus a tested federation. Is you're essentially just relying on, you know, the World Anti-Doping Association's regulations around what is classified as a performance-enhancing drug or agent, and then what is classified as what legal and illegal use.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think caffeine is a cool example because there's lots of drugs that the general population would consider extremely dangerous that are used in bodybuilding. I can give you an example, like insulin. Insulin has a reputation to be extremely dangerous. But the LD50, in fact, for anybody listening that doesn't know what the LD50 is, this is the lethal dose 50. So the relative dose, the relative total amount of a drug that would kill roughly 50% of the population if they took that. And you can measure drug toxicity roughly on the distance between a clinically efficacious dose and the LD50. So what is going to work and what is going to potentially kill you. And the distance between those two would also rate the safety of a drug. Toxicology would be the wrong word to use specifically. But insulin, distance between effective and LD50 for many analogs, like Lantus, for example, one that people, again, see as extremely dangerous, that's further apart than caffeine. The ethics are a bit blurred. I think what's also important is there are no ethics in science, in biochemistry. Ethics don't really exist. There's just molecules and their actions.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So
Sorry,
I think
that was outside already. So,
yeah, that's a topic to think about, right? Because most people will be on one side of the fence with PEDs, and whether it's, you know, it's cheating, it's the only thing not they wouldn't do in their bodybuilding or physique enhancement, they won't go for it. And then you've got the other side who take performance enhancing drugs and they see it just as a means to an end. So I think just we need to clarify that there's no real right or wrong. It just depends on where you lie on this. But I think the amount of people who will probably listen to this will show us that it'll be one of the more popular episodes for a reason, right? Because people get curious about them, especially when we're talking about steroids and how they can affect the goals in terms of physique, whether that's competitive or just your average sort of gym rat. So with steroids in particular, and Dean, we'll go to you on this one. What is a steroid and how does it affect our physique goals then?
Well, I mean, a steroid in itself is realistically just a hormone that we are either going to have endogenously produced from our body that naturally is occurring, like testosterone, estrogen, those sorts of things. Or it could be something that is exogenously given or put into the individual from the outside in, being exogenous, endogenous being inside. And it's anything that's going to be hormonally effective to the body that we can put in ourselves. Like typically when we refer, these get crossed all the time. So typically when people refer to steroids, they're referring to anabolic androgenic steroids, which are going to be different derivations of the parent hormone testosterone that has then been manipulated for the purpose of typically like clinical research to try and improve somebody's lifestyle. But we're now using them for performance. But that's probably a general concept of what a steroid is. But it doesn't have to necessarily be muscle growing. You know, we can have steroids that are anti-inflammatory and the likes as well. Yeah.
And I think that's the ones that most people will probably have heard of, like their mom or their nan or something, they're suddenly on steroids for a chest infection. And that we need to clear up that that's completely different to what a bodybuilder would use to get ready for stage or to grow in an off season, right?
I could expand on that briefly as well. So yes, steroid just meaning hormone, but also to dig a little more specific into our cohort here. I would refer to testosterone, like Dean mentioned, the parent hormone as just an androgen, just an endogenous or exogenous androgen, but a bioidentical molecule. I probably wouldn't refer to testosterone as an anabolic steroid. I think when we discuss anabolic steroids, we discuss the synthetic modifications that have been made to the testosterone molecule over time to make it more anabolic and or less androgenic. So there's the two sides to, if we're going to discuss what is a steroid. In fact, anybody that is interested, I'm going to throw in a plug straight away. On the Physique Collective website, I had a little cartoon made by an animator on what is a steroid, and I made it so simple because such a simple question, which so many anabolic androgenic steroid users can't really rationally answer with specifics. But you can split it up into anabolic. This is what's anabolic, and you have things like protein accretion, basically to gain a new muscle. What's androgenic, and that's where we talk about masculinization effects, whether it be like neurological things like aggression and fear aversion and weird other things that come there, or terminal hair growth, and etc. Everyone knows what masculinization is, as compared to anabolism. And over time, those hormones have been adjusted to be more anabolic and or less androgenic for clinical outcomes, for use in women and children and the elderly and things like this.
Yeah. Okay, and what other categories of drugs might be considered when we're talking about somebody looking to enhance their physique? Like growth hormone, we spoke about insulin already. What about stuff specifically for fat loss? Like, let's go dig a bit deeper into the other drugs apart from steroids that might be deployed to aid that goal.
Who do you want to take that?
Go, Dean, let's go with you then.
Well, we've got what have we mentioned so far? Some of the terms that Joe used before were lipolytics, or things that are going to drive up lipolysis. So things like clenbuterol. What else have we got? We've got things that could be metabolic regulators like thyroid. We have varying types of stimulants like yohimbine that could be topped in with the clenbuterol as well. What else am I missing, Joe?
So you've got a beta-2 pathway, beta-2 adrenergic agonist, which would be clenbuterol. Basically, we're talking about stimulation of pathways that do stuff here. So within a fat cell, within an adipocyte, we're talking about lipolysis, you'll have alpha and beta cells. You can agonize beta, i.e. activate beta cells to drive more lipolysis, and you would use clenbuterol to do that. You can antagonize alpha with an alpha-2 adrenergic antagonist, like we mentioned, yohimbine. You've got things that catalyze the lipolysis process, like nutrient transporters, like injectable L-carnitine. Thyroid, you mentioned, so T4, T3. PPAR modulation, you could argue, increases things like fat oxidation. So you could use cardarine, which I wouldn't advise, or telmisartan. Recombinant human growth hormone for free fatty acid mobilization, so growth hormone. And there's something to be said about there being androgen receptors in adipocytes as well. So anabolic steroids do contribute to fat loss, but not to a particularly meaningful degree. It's more so that they contribute to reducing lipogenesis. So your ability to gain fat in periods that you are feeding is less.
Yeah, I think that we've already mentioned the other one too, would be like insulin.
Yep.
Or similar sort of, glucose disposal agents or glucose regulation, things like metformin. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, and then obviously there's a lot to think about when you're talking about all these different categories. And I know, Joe, I've listened to a podcast you've done about the safer model use for performance enhancing drugs. So if this is something that somebody is either doing now and they're potentially doing it really fucking wrong, or somebody who's literally just on the fence and we want to educate them on how to do it better, what would be the first sort of steps to educating them on how to use performance enhancing drugs to the maximum effect for their goals with the minimum health risks?
Yeah. So for me, all of my clients, I think I've got like 2 clients that are natural now, and the majority of my clients are competitors. So And the majority of my clients uniquely are also sort of higher level competitors like Dean. So we're talking about inevitably working in moderate to high risk outcomes. Then that's not me for 1 second saying that Dean uses PEDs. What we're talking about is, look, there's PED use here. We have to accept that and move beyond that. That's an option, that there is going to be increased risk. So my focus becomes, how can we still achieve the desired end result, and then create an ethical scenario between me and the client of what cost to benefit ratio thereafter. And then a really easy example would be we've got 20 pounds of muscle to gain tissue in 2 years, which is a fairly lofty goal of stage weight. Now, there's multiple models that you could use to get there. We need to decide which one carries the least stress. And there's certain rules, guidelines that I would use along the way to get there, essentially.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they're deciding upon that they want to use drugs to facilitate more growth than they can do naturally, they do it off the cuff without really thinking about the considerations for the long-term deleterious effects that these things may have on them. Because most people, when they think about tomorrow, very few people think about tomorrow 5 years from now, Yeah. And the reality is, like Joe said, there's many ways you could get to that 20 pounds. You could put that 20 pounds on relatively quickly, but that's obviously going to come at a great cost. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are trying to chase the gain at rapid speed without any consideration for what that will do from the inside out. So the first thing there is to decide is, what is the cost to benefit ratio, and how much cost are you willing to give in order to grab the benefit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, longevity in the sport is important. Anyone that's been in bodybuilding has seen someone have incredible results over 3-6 months. It's rarer to see individuals improve year on year for 5, 6, 7 years. And it's very important that you temper your fatigue load that's driven through PD use to be able to do that. It's very easy to gain a shitload of muscle quickly. It's not very easy to make year on year improvements without massively negatively affecting your health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then with that, let's just talk very briefly about the sort of stuff you would track when you're taking performance enhancing drugs. So Dean, why don't you kick us off with that, about the different health markers and different things that we can assess during a phase where we're taking drugs to make sure that we are as healthy as possible.
Yeah, I think if we could assume that somebody's already doing it, or if they're intending on using any variation of PEDs, that these are the things you want to consider long-term use. First and foremost would be getting regular blood panels to determine the internal impacts on things like cholesterol, kidney health. I'm also scratching my dog so he doesn't cry here, so just forgive me if I sometimes pause. That would be one metric to obviously look at. That one's going to be the least regular, but it's also the most costly and the things that change the slowest. So we're not going to do that as frequently as, say, the other metrics we may track might be things just like a daily blood pressure. Because with anybody that's escalating weight, let alone escalating weight via means of using anabolic steroids, is going to potentially drive up things like blood pressure. Other basics would be blood glucose first thing in the morning. You could also look at postprandial or after feeding if you had concerns long-term about your insulin sensitivity and things like that. Just an average resting heart rate or pulse rate. That's going to give us some indication as to the sort of how efficient the heart is working in regards to the beats per minute required to facilitate enough blood flow to fuel the system, or to support the system is probably a better term. What else we got? Long-term would be echocardiogram. So actual imaging of the heart to determine if we're getting any morphological changes of things like the left ventricle or eccentric left ventricular hypertrophy. And again, another concern for anyone that's escalating body weight regardless, but you're doubling down here if you're using anabolic androgenic steroids. What else am I missing, Joe? Anything else?
No, that's literally it. Blood work, periodize every 12 weeks or so. Blood glucose and blood pressure daily, if not 3 or 4 times a week. Annual echocardiogram. You could maybe get a urinalysis to check for microalbuminuria or something, but that might just be prompted by blood work issues. If you're watching something like an EGFR, but bodybuilders have issues with the EGFR equation sometimes with the creatinine escalation. But no, that's pretty much it. I think that's pretty comprehensive, and it would be good just to see people doing that.
Or even 50% of it, to be perfectly honest.
Yep.
It's amazing how difficult it is to get an individual to spend $30 on a glucometer and maybe $200 on a blood pressure cuff, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're willing to go and spend $1,000 on GH.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the
at least in
easiest thing
Australia,
to do,
maybe.
right?
I was going to say, not here.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things, right? Is like, I mean, if you give no fucks about your health and you just want to get massive, then by all means, do whatever you want. It's your body, it's your vessel. You do whatever you want with it. However, if you do want to do this for a long period of time, then there's certain precautions you have to take in order to minimize the likelihood of you kicking the bucket, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, it's 200, maybe $300 for the glucometer and the blood pressure cuff. It's not really that much when you think about how much you're going to use it. If you're talking about, multiple times per week over the course of the time you're going to be competing or into this physique enhancement game, it's not a big cost. Something like bloods as well, like they can be relatively expensive over here, but not really when you consider the health impacts that the drugs can have on you and the long-term effects as well. So yeah, definitely go out and get it done. Maybe do you mode an ECG run over here? Because I know they're normally
It'll
quite
depend on the
expensive.
doctor you speak to, man. Like I've had ECGs done for free. I've had an echo done for free on Medicare as well. Like I had, left ventricular hypertrophy, like slightly, very, very moderate. And because of that, the doctor was willing for me to do like an annual or every 2-year checkup for free. But an echo is typically like $400-$500.
Okay, yeah.
Not including private health. But let me sell it this way to anyone who's listening that isn't prepared to pay for it. If you can take these metrics on a regular basis and you otherwise come back relatively healthy for what you're doing, the likelihood is that you can extend your use. You can do it for longer and grow for longer if you're healthy. But if you don't fucking do anything about these metrics, the chances are you're going to have to stop and start far quicker. So your gains will actually be less,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good argument that most people will be able to understand if they're kind of on the fence about whether to do this or not, like thinking about the long-term gains versus doing some damage and having to stop and start all the time.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And then let's go to some fact or fiction. So a lot of people think that there is certain drugs for cutting and bulking. Do you believe that's the case? Because I know a lot of coaches are kind of like one way or the other. And if you do believe there's certain drugs for certain circumstances, what drugs would they be?
So first thing, there are no drugs that were synthesized to be used in bodybuilding. So drug for prep or drug for off-season. Now, maybe there are drugs of which their action suits the end goal specifically. There's also a great degree of inter-individual concern there. But what we need to do is paint things much more simply with the PEDs that we use and just take a step back and say, what are the actions of this drug? What do I require in this moment? Is the drug suitable for me in this moment? Because it can vary greatly. I had a situation recently where I took on a competitor. Here's a bit of a cliche example, but one that paints a picture. I took on a competitor that had just competed in middleweights and didn't do too well. Look wasn't great, running a very typical prep stack. And based on his needs, I pretty much took him off of, to anybody that's familiar, things like this, or took drastically down the inputs like the trenbolone and the masteron. I removed any kind of estrogen modulation. We put estrogen essentially as high as we could get it. And he competed 2 weeks later in the heavyweights and took third.
Wow.
So the deployment was wrong, although it was the standardized accepted input. But for the individual who is genetically unique and whose scenario is unique, it's the right tools for the right job. And this is the way that you need to look at drugs, and that can change based on the individual. So quite simply, to cut through all of the confusion, take a needs analysis of what these drugs do. Deploy them as needed. So are there cutting and bulking drugs? Maybe for you, maybe. And that can change as well. I'll give you another easy example because we spoke about Cal on the last episode, right? So one of my clients, Callum, when I first began working with him, he was 200 pounds and we needed more quote unquote retention He was a beanpole, and we used a lot of nandrolone. So a lot of nandrolone, probably wouldn't be a lot to what most people would use, but let's say we'd work up to roughly 15 milligram per kilogram of nandrolone, which is a drug that's seen as an off-season drug, a growth drug. Now he's 100 pounds heavier than that. We don't use that drug anymore because we use any kind of retentive drug. His training is slow, it's laborious, he can't move, can't sleep well. It's the wrong drug. So there's a needs analysis to take for every phase that you're in.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of misassociation with what the drug is and what the drug does in our industry. And it's primarily, from what I can gather, based upon just anecdote from previous users, and also, like I said, a misassociation. Most people, like if we went down like the standardized stack, it is you start with slow ested base testosterones and nandrolones and like highly retentive drugs at the start of a contest prep, and towards the back end of a contest prep, you take out those drugs because they quote unquote will make you hold water. All these things that aren't necessarily true for everyone. As Joe said, there's individual variability here. And then they move to, faster acting testosterones. They bring in what they would classify as hardening agents, in that they use trenbolone and masteron because these things don't convert to estrogen, with estrogen being the assumed water retentive problem, which typically it isn't. And we have these people then also progressively getting leaner and leaner and leaner and leaner. So the assumption is that as I get leaner and then I add in these drugs, I look better. Therefore, these drugs cause this look. When in reality, it's just the dieting that's primarily causing the look, and the drugs are being laid in at a time that they can't even control or determine what the actual the impact is. Whereas you take someone like Joe and many others in this industry, where they think about, okay, like what is the primary effect of this drug? Most of those are going to be, like we said, they're going to have an anabolic nature to them. They're going to attach the AR, drive protein accretion. And then what are the secondary characteristics of that drug that may offer us a benefit in this particular stage? So like maybe we want some retention at the back end of a contest prep because we are becoming more bean polish, like Cal was at the beginning, or maybe we want some more neurological drive because we're progressively losing strength because we don't have as much muscular fullness anymore. And then you can start to pick from the tools. Whereas most people are like, I need to cut down this really small tree. Let's just get the chainsaw and hope for the fucking best. And they probably could have just used, like a butter knife or something.
Okay.
That's good. Specificity is number one when it comes to drug deployment. I had a bunch of clients over my house at the weekend that are competing in 2 weeks' time, and there was one guy that was competing in 4 weeks' time, and they were absolutely miffed. They couldn't understand that they were all using different drugs in different amounts. It's like, you're very different people. Specificity is key.
Yeah. And then what about, obviously there's a lot of drugs that are faked, because when the raws are imported from China or whatever country they end up coming in from, it's cheapest to basically buy like the testosterone stuff versus the stuff needed to make other compounds. So a lot of the time stuff like primobolan would be faked, or anavar for females. And obviously this has potential side effects, like health side effects, if somebody thinks they're taking one drug and they're actually taking something else. So what do you think would be the common fake stuff out there that people, both male and females, need to look out for?
Males are a lot luckier though, yeah. Like this is the difference, is that Anavar faked for a male that could be either just powder or it could be something like stanazolol or Winstrol, whichever you want to call it, is not really that impactful to the male, but to the female, the impact here is a lot larger. So it's riskier for women. Similarly with primobolan, if they think they're getting primobolan and they're actually getting primatestin, not that they get that brand, but testosterone enanthate, the actual molecule, potentially problematic depending on how much they're using, But I would say in Australia, I don't know if it's the same for you, Joe, but probably the most commonly things that you'll see, the common things you'll see that will not be what they may suggest they are, is primobolan, Anavar, GH.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case over here, but to be perfectly honest, I so rarely, in fact, I cannot even remember a single example of seeing something fake. Maybe that's because I'm lucky to be around underground labs that are of a higher quality or something like this, but I've never had an issue with something being faked with a client or with myself. But these drugs are very readily available in the UK.
Yeah. Okay, and then let's go into that as well, because obviously there's legality issues in the UK versus Australia, even to America, where people can easily get testosterone replacement therapy and other things pretty easily from a hormone clinic. Joe, let's start with you. So what's the actual laws in the UK around buying and having on you performance or steroids, essentially.
So I've also got a little animation on this. Something that's misunderstood. I'll summarize it briefly. There's some nuance, but essentially owning anabolic steroids for personal use, and there's a bit of a gray area around what is considered personal use. There's been some interesting court cases with people with crates and crates of anabolics that have gone away with personal use and the opposite. But to have on your person and to use anabolic steroids is completely legal. To sell, to distribute is illegal.
It's such a random concept, though. So how do you get them?
Also, like, we have very strange things like yihimbing that's allowed, I'm bringing this up again, in natural competitions, but this is illegal in the United Kingdom.
Similarly here, you can't buy yihimbine over the counter legally, yet it's still not classified as an illegal substance in wild or tested sports.
Yeah.
It's actually very similar to some drug policies, and I think like Brazil is the same. Legal to possess for personal use for a lot of drugs, but distribution is basically classified by the police officer that takes the person in. So you'll have some people that will be booked for possession, some people will be booked for distribution, and they could have the exact same amount.
Right.
So it's risky, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. But pretty
but
much
in Australia, it's just illegal.
Yeah.
Underline.
Which is why we're talking about this from a knowledge point, right? We're not saying anyone takes anything. We're just this is just to explain things.
It doesn't look like it, but I do. So that's okay. Dean does not. And he's bigger than me.
Good genetics. Good genetics.
I just trained to a closer proximity to failure.
That's what it is.
Okay, so let's get in, boys, to one of the questions that somebody threw up, and we weren't sure whether to really bring it in, but somebody asked about if they're following these influencers or coaches and that, and the influencer in question or the coach in question doesn't necessarily say whether or not they take performance-enhancing drugs, but it's often of debate. For example, a high-level IFBB pro or WBFF pro, you know, somebody who's maybe been training for 10 years and maybe natural, it just takes a while to get where they got to, obviously, or maybe very athletic, very blessed genetically, and may not need drugs. Is there any way, or what's the best way to sort of get an inkling if these people actually might use drugs? Because most people are in the dark about this. They're just assuming that people don't take them whenever they might be, or the other hand, people might say somebody definitely takes stuff when they could just be very genetically blessed.
Yeah, there's no black and white way to tell other than asking the person. I think the only way you could probably get a reasonable look at it would be to look at the rate of progress over time, but you're not necessarily privy to that a lot of the time, you know? Yeah. Like I know some high-end WBFF competitors that if you looked at them in a vacuum, as in just today, you would go, oh, I assume that they use something. Mm-hmm. But if you look at their rate of progress from like year 1 through to year 3, it's significant. Year 3 to year 6, it's less significant. And then year 6 to year 10, it's getting even insignificant almost now. It's just that most people are only looking at the individual as they stand there today, and therefore they assume that that has to be, you know, drug induced because they're not there yet because they're 10 years behind. Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly a cynic in that most people that compete, there's an assumption for me that they're probably tinkering with something if they're in an untested sport or in an untested federation, because, I mean, if you're not, you're likely at a disadvantage to other individuals. But that doesn't mean that everyone is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I generally wonder about, like, who cares? Like, it's a weird kind of question as well. In bodybuilding, it doesn't matter. You know, we don't have rules here. It's a physique sport, and people use fillers, like we discussed on OPD the other day. People use site enhancement. People use anabolic steroids. It doesn't matter. You look the way you look, and you're going to win or you're not on the day. There's such a great variability in genetic response to every single hypertrophy input. Training, diet, stress management, drugs. The variability is so astronomical. I've got a consultation client that's a relatively new client that is a physique competitor on the Olympia stage, who's natural, who's just had to start using TRT because of prep. induced prep mediated hormone attenuation, basically unable to recover post show. Now, because of multiple times competing, you'd never look at him and think that he's natural, but he is. Otherwise he wouldn't be paying money to consult with me to tell him how to use TRT privately. But and on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got regional level competitors that are placing dead last that are using 2 to 5 grams of androgens. How can you tell? Rate of progress for sure. In women, there's going to be a degree of obvious. In fact, no, in men and women, there's going to be a degree like if you're 250-pound lean male, highly unlikely any genetic capability to do that. If you're a female whose voice has dropped 3 tones and is hypermuscular, it's likely. But there's variants, you know, there's hyperandrogenic women with PCOS that do express similar levels of virilization to competitors. Just won't worry about it.
I think that is a fair one. Yes, like maybe sometimes structurally you can see some changes in individuals, but again, you're still looking at a timeline here. You're not talking about now, tomorrow, you know?
Yeah.
Because there's certainly guys with far more masculine looking faces than mine who've used nothing, you know? How much stock, Joe, would you put in like a fat-free mass index?
Not a lot. I'm not particularly convinced by that literature. I don't think there's too much real. I don't think we can say for certain that this thing exists with such large genetic spectrum, especially since any bodybuilding coach that has done this for a while has seen people that blow that out of the water as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. They certainly exist. There's obviously outliers everywhere, right? I can't remember going to high school with a kid who had lats that I could have rock climbed on, and he was in grade 11, you know, and he was a swimmer and a rugby player, and the dude was honestly, man, probably walked around at like 8-week out condition, jacked as a motherfucker as a 16-year-old, and so did his brother. Like they were just like that, you know. I don't know if it's my perception though, and that I think he was much larger than what I would think now because I was also 80 kilos at that time, you know. So maybe there's a little bit of perception error there, but yeah, I mean, I don't care.
Yeah, I think to sum it up, basically, we can't really know. Like the person who looks like dog shit in the gym might be taking the most amount, and the person who isn't taking anything might be the best looking person in the gym. There's no way to really know unless the person tells you themselves. But if you were to look at fertilization, especially in females, and the rate of gain over the period, like if somebody explodes really quickly, perhaps then that's going to be drug use. If it's more of a slow, steady gain, then probably just could be either way, really, I guess.
Yeah. And even like you could look at their competition status in regards to their weight over time. Again, we're doing more of a reflective look at what they've achieved, because like we've got like high quality natural bodybuilders like Brandon Kempter right now, right? Who you look at that guy in the off season, and I honestly sometimes look at him and go, fuck, he's as big as I am. And he's lean, he's 100 kilos, he looks great. But he always ends up still sub 80 kilos when he competes. And like, that doesn't happen to me. So then you're like, oh, hang on a minute. Okay. So some people also hold their weight exceptionally well in the off season. Again, this is just genetic variability. Yeah. But naturals typically aren't getting back on stage with more than a pound on them from year to year, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And then what about when we're talking about the safer use model for Joe? I know I've definitely listened to one where you were talking about the female use and all the different pathways we can manipulate before we actually get into taking, you know, whether it's tablets or depending on how far they want to push it, what category, potentially going down the injectable route. But most coaches automatically think, oh, take a tablet or half a tablet per day. But like it kind of blew my mind a little bit when you started to talk about all these different pathways we can manipulate before we even get there. So do you mind going a bit of detail into that and what we can sort of look at from the female perspective?
So the fundamental first thing with any PD using women is understand that you're androgen sensitive. Women, children, the elderly are sensitive to the negative consequences, if you want to call virilization negative. Certainly not negative if you're looking for gender reassignment. But for physique purposes, yeah, that's going to be a negative outcome. So androgens would always be my first choice for a male, given that they're androgen insensitive, so moderate dosages of testosterone, for example. For a woman, that's the last option. So we're looking at ways that we would modulate all of the things that we mentioned when it comes to turning protein accretion up, turning muscle protein breakdown down, pushing fat loss up, pushing fat gain down. with other drug pathways that are non-androgenic in nature. And eventually you can escalate to the use of androgens on an as-needed basis. But a couple of things would be, one, have the other drugs in there first to see if you can get to your desired end result. And if not, then you can bring the androgens in with many synergistic relationships and permissive relationships. Don't know what a permissive relationship is. It's just when one thing helps the other one work better rather than working with it to create a larger outcome. With these other drugs in place, which means overall androgen exposure over time is going to be less.
Awesome.
Did you want examples of those drugs?
Yeah, I was just about to ask that. Yeah.
Okay, so like we went through every single pathway, we'd be talking about beta-2 androgenergic agonism, so clenbuterol. Clenbuterol has anabolic outcomes as well. It phosphorylates mTOR. You don't need to worry about that too much. We're talking about turning on the machinery that can lend itself to muscle growth over long periods and low and slow, like we mentioned, especially for a woman, creating this like basal dose of PDs, which I think is important, something that's like tolerable over long durations, which androgens aren't, is important. So you've got so many. Clenbuterol, like we mentioned, yohimbine, thyroid drugs, injectable L-carnitine, angiotensin receptor blockers / PPAR modulators like telmisartan, growth hormone, insulin, metformin, other GDAs like berberine. That's a lot of drugs that I've mentioned, and we haven't got to anabolics yet. And I'll many times in my career, I've had this with a bikini athlete who needs to add 3 or 4 pounds of musculature. Hey Joe, I'm thinking about using some Anavar or something. It's like, you could quite easily do that over your next off season without touching an androgen. You know, let's say we've got a perfect 12 months ahead of us, training wise, diet wise, stress, sleep management wise, whatever. These drugs without the use of androgens, I promise you, even in genetically poor responders to some degree, obviously not, if you're a non-responder, this isn't going to help, but even in the poorer end of genetics, that's a lot of anabolism when you put all of those things together.
Yeah. I mean, this includes a SARM, but I've seen a female put on 2.5 kilos of stage weight, including the prep, in 12 months, just on clenbuterol and ostarine.
Ostarine, yeah, I knew you were going to say. What dose of ostarine?
Easy. 5 milligrams.
Yeah, so a non-steroidal SARM that's very tissue selective, studied up to 3 milligrams and pretty well tolerated. I wouldn't be concerned about a female using 5 milligrams of ostarine in terms of androgenicity, even over the long term. So this is, you know, that kind of model is great.
I mean, I love this model, obviously, myself as well. And I think the biggest thing that we get that's difficult is this idea again, and this incorrect perception that a needle equals bad. You know, when in actual fact, likely the administration via an injection is likely going to be healthier across most things, or potentially more efficacious. Like we take that L-carnitine, for example. L-carnitine bioavailability is just dog shit, you know. But as from the injectable route, it has like many benefits. And you have girls, you could say like, you know, these are all of the pathways that Joe just mentioned. You know, you've got orals in the PPAR agonist, you've got injectable in the L-carnitine, injectable in the insulin, and injectable in the GH. So there's 3 injectables there that you're potentially recommending to a female in the safe use model that is non-androgen based, that is going to be advantageous to growth and or body recomposition without the risk of masculinization or virilization, right? And yet we have other people that are saying you should not use injectables of any sorts. You're better off just to use a half a tab of X. And as far as I'm concerned, that's just like horrendously poor advice, because again, that person is assuming that needle equals bad, you know? And then you can even draw that further if you then do go down the androgen route. It's like, what's the first available androgen that may or may not be the safer choice for the individual, you know?
Yeah.
And then we're going down that route of, like we mentioned before, like a primobolan, for example, or, you know, Joe's spoken many times. Yeah.
There's a fear of injections. There's also a fear of polypharmacy. When polypharmacy is key. If you're trying to use any PEDs, safer, men or women, there's something that's been going around for a long time on old bodybuilding forums. You have to earn the right to use growth hormone, to earn the right to use insulin. You don't need to use these things until you're working at over 1 gram or something, which is just total nonsense. It's backwards. Or you don't need exotic drugs like Masteron. You can, you know, 1 gram of testosterone is all you need. About total nonsense. These drugs have been invented for the purpose of attenuating some of the negatives that come with testosterone. And the use of a polypharmacy model, and for those of you that don't know, that's just many drug mechanisms all in one, is far safer. You'll see this from the work of Professor Scott Howells, who's an incredible educator in this area, is you see the relative toxicities of drugs come when you turn up one drug pathway excessively. Risk is introduced to turn up any pathway, but revving on, for example, with males that just use androgens, revving on that very hard as compared to a lower dose of androgens, plus insulin, plus growth hormone, plus a PPAR modulator, plus L-carnitine, so on and so forth, that's going to be far kinder to your health over the long term.
Oh.
Yeah, perfect. And then what about side effects? Because I've definitely heard it before that with females, I know we're nailing females here over the past 10 minutes here, but what's that?
Nailing females, man. That's what we
I was going to say, that choice of word was perfect. It was completely unintended. I'm like, yeah, I'll take
completely unintended. So obviously with female use, the suggestion is that it's potentially not the dose that people take, but it's the length that they're on the compound. What's your thoughts around that, guys?
So for females, duration is much more important if we're looking at it in a vacuum than dose. If we had to compare the virilization outcomes of, let's say, 50 milligram of nandrolone for 8 weeks versus 100 milligrams of nandrolone for 4, the virilization capacity would be less in the 4-week model, despite the androgen load being the same.
Okay, yeah.
I think if you could draw like a practical take home for this, and that if you do look at people that are going via transgender, they're trying to shift from female to male. Typically, the dose isn't escalated over time, but rather just the exposure of time is just escalated just by virtue of them being on the drug for longer, and then you start to see the virilization accumulate over time. And it's like just a perfect real world scenario as to what's going on clinically.
Yeah, that makes sense. So potentially something like a red flag to look out for with coaches is if somebody's starting a prep and their coach is saying, oh, you need to start this now at 12 weeks out or whatever, versus a coach who might put something in at 4 weeks or 6 weeks, obviously less potential virilization versus the coach who does longer, obviously.
And this is an argument that Joe said before too, of like the right tool for the right job is like, what do you need out of the drug category to drive up the particular outcome you're looking for a female in a contest prep? Now, a lot of them aren't trying to grow a ton of tissue in the prep. What they're just trying to do is cosmetically drive up the look at the back end. Yeah. And we know that females are also less susceptible to lose muscle than males are in a prep. You can typically diet them fairly hard and they're fairly resilient. Well, they're both sensitive to change and resilient to change in a weird sense, sensitive in that they have a lot of negative feedback with like fluid retention, stuff like that, but then quite resilient in that they don't lose tissue. You don't need to expose them to that for 12 weeks unless you're a really shit coach and you're using it using it as your means to try and drive the result,
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And let's try to get a male example in. So let's say, for example, you guys pick up a coaching client who's your average gym rat, has been doing his sort of own cycles. Now, we're not going to talk doses because obviously each case will be different, but what would be the first sort of steps you would take from taking the average gym goer with a relatively high androgen load to a more safer use? Like, would it be lowering the dose or changing compounds around slightly, or would it be just getting them to track their bloods and then changing everything based off that? What's really the next step, I guess, for somebody who's a bro who's just doing this themselves and they want to try to get towards a better way of doing things?
Dean, you take this for a sec, bro. I'm going to run to the toilet.
It's a hard one to unpack because, like, I know this is a cop-out answer and that everyone's different, but that the reality is that everybody is. What I typically like to see is that the individual using PEDs understands cause and effect, understands cost to benefit ratios, and then has a decent, or at least a base level understanding of what each compound is going to offer them in regards to that cause and effect or cost and benefit. And in order for you to do that, you really need to strip them back to like what would be classified as somewhere in that testosterone replacement therapy range and start again. You know, if they came to us and say the cycle design was relatively okay, you could just tweak little small bits and pieces within it and continue on. So long as their metrics are good, so long as their blood pressure is good, their resting heart rate's good, blood glucose is good, all of those metrics that we mentioned at the start, blood work's good, then you could just continue on and slightly modify. But if we're going under the assumption that the polypharmacy that they're using is poorly managed or poorly designed, then the only way for you to try and fix that, I think, and educate at the same time so they don't make really rash, poor decisions later on, is to start fresh again. Pull it all back, go back to a testosterone base, figure out how much testosterone that they can tolerate without any other drug in the system before they get off-target side effects, and then start to layer in things that offer you benefit on top of that.
Yeah, okay. And what do you think then would be the highest sort of dose that you would have seen somebody have of like testosterone without, just test only, without any side effects? Like what's been reported to you, perhaps?
I would say the average person that I've been at least privy to seeing their numbers, most guys are sitting somewhere between 350 and 500 milligrams per week.
Okay, yeah.
Some guys as low as 200 though. I have guys that are definitely saying as low as 200 that respond exceptionally well to that testosterone and don't require any more.
Right. Okay, I didn't hear Dean's answer, so I'll give you some see if we agree.
Yeah,
if we don't, then Dean's right. So blood work, I don't think can give you any objective answer on what your stack design should be or anything like this. Other than maybe if you got some like hormonal blood work and your androgen-estrogen ratio is just dreadful. But that leads me on to something that you would just see in the stack design is immediate concern is removing any deleterious ancillary drug use to support a poorly structured stack design. So use of something like Arimidex or a selective estrogen receptor modulator like tamoxifen. If you're using these drugs, then quite simply your drug model is off. There's a problem with it. It's not well thought out. It's not well structured. It's incorrect and not only deleterious to your health, but also your performance and your physique outcomes. So it would be that. There's also a consideration that over time, the use of drugs are fatiguing. There's good evidence that androgens drive sympathetic tone within the autonomic nervous system. There's no downregulation or desensitization that happens at the androgen receptor. In fact, quite the opposite. There's upregulation of androgen receptors. Sensitivity doesn't seem to change, although lacking good literature on that. But over time, like any other fatigue driver, like training or calorie surplus, you need to pull these down and resensitize, for lack of a better word. So if the individual's been running drugs for a while, I would just be putting them right back down to their baseline for a period of time and just start again with an intelligent stack design, essentially.
Yep. That's
to the opposite. I said double down, mate.
Well,
No, that is true. I didn't actually mention the ancillaries, and it's a topic of discussion that I think is important for people to hear, because the same thing, like I don't know of any clients currently that I'm aware of that are using those drugs. Not that I would prescribe them, of course. But for the entertainment purposes, when I talk to my clients, none of them use them,
Yeah.
It's just unnecessary. Like realistically, you can think of that as it's like you're plugging a hole that you created. So just don't create the hole to begin with.
Yeah. And can we touch a little bit on the misconception that estrogen is bad and that we need to have the lowest amount possible as a result of our stack design and all this stuff that gets thrown in? Because often it's, these competitors who throw in like letrozole at 2 weeks out or whatever to dry themselves out, and they end up like tanking estrogen and all the potential negatives that come from that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to trade you out. I'm going to relay you, Joe, and say you can take this one because I'm going to do likewise.
Okay, cool. So actually, in the last episode that we did on female birth control, we went through some of the fabulous things that estrogen does. Estrogen, if you look at the molecule's actions, which we should do when we're analyzing a needs basis for deployment, it's a wonderful molecule for bodybuilding purposes. So very anabolic in and of itself. It's probably the only thing unique to testosterone that makes it work, maybe arguably better than some other anabolic steroids to some degree. Estrogen is also lipolytic and anti-lipogenic in the right circumstances. It also increases, so aromatase action increases hepatic IGF-1 secretion as well. So more local and autocrine, paracrine, IGF-1, essentially IGF-1 in the muscle cell, which is where the testosterone growth hormone synergy will be created. Estrogen really is better up to the point of view tolerating it well. You know, there's going to be a maximum tolerable limit before your androgen estrogen ratio is in a place where you as a genetically unique individual cannot tolerate any more estrogen, and put your estrogen there. And you mentioned prep and the kind of rhetoric that people use, AIs and SERMs before a show. This is for fluid manipulation. There's a couple of things that are relevant when it comes to discussing what drives water retention. So firstly, every single anabolic steroid increases water retention. The question becomes where. Like, you want water retention in the muscle cell, you know, you want to be as full as possible. You need estrogen, or rather you need fluid retention. Estrogen is one contributor. There's a greater contributor in the form of aldosterone that also all anabolics increase. Using an angiotensin receptor blocker will limit that, which is what makes them so favorable when it comes to attenuating particular, specifically left ventricular wall hypertrophy within the renin-angiotensin system. But estrogen-wise, estrogen also has a lot to do with glucose transport rate, so GLUT4 potentiation essentially. So how many times, Dean, have you heard someone say, you know, I was carving up so much and nothing would stick? It's like, well, you know, your ability to partition carbohydrates is pretty damn low if you've got low estrogen. I gave the example of that competitor. That was a situation there where we got him into the heavyweights. You know, just that ability to actually just partition carbohydrates was much better. So fluid retention, if you're fat-free, is favorable, because if you haven't got any fat cell space to push fluid into, where are you going to hold your fluid? You know, intramuscular. If you don't quite nail it, if you're not peeled, which is your fault, then yeah, you might need to modulate estrogen. But I probably would just recommend you don't do the show if you're not ready.
Yeah.
But even then, even if you were to say modulate estrogen, like, you could acutely do that very quickly, you know?
Very. Yeah.
You know, we're talking about an action of, if you were to choose, say, something like a Arimidex or Romacin, like, the action of that's going to happen within 24 to 48 hours of visual representation of that change. You know, so you don't need to be tanking estrogen for the last 4 weeks. You know,
no, I've had scenarios with consults with guys that weren't ready, that were doing the show, where we've maybe loaded carbohydrates Wednesday, Thursday for a Saturday show, squashed the estrogen on the Friday, coming on the Saturday, haven't inhibited your ability to load carbohydrates. But that's like making the best of a shit situation. Agreed.
Yeah, if there's no fat, there's nowhere fluid can hold, except for inside the muscle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And then, do you think there's anything, we've been on for roughly an hour, I want to say, is there anything you think we've missed out that people need to know as the sort of this background episode to performance enhancing drugs, or particularly steroids in this case, as we've went down the rabbit hole on?
Maybe the placement of Trenbolone, the use of Trenbolone. There's a lot of myths surrounding Trenbolone.
Yeah.
So if we discuss, firstly, we could talk for hours on this alone, but there's something called the Hirschberger assay, which is where the original anabolic androgenic ratings came from. Please excuse any noise, by the way. I've just seen the postman walking up my drive, and the dogs don't like the postman. Sometimes he just leaves there we go. Shut his door. He actually leaves on the doorstep, and Hunter knows that he's there. Anyway, so this assay was essentially using rodents. So we take the levator ani of a rodent, which is a smooth muscle, not a skeletal muscle, which is the first issue. It's actually like the anus muscle of a rat. And then the seminal vesicle. So we can imagine comparing in a human, prostate weight versus muscle weight, and androgenicity being expressed in organ weight increase, and anabolism being expressed in muscle weight increase. Problem being, one is rodents, and anybody that's familiar with literature in general, in terms of clinical significance, rodent data very, very rarely translate to human data. And of course, the problem that the levator ani isn't even a skeletal muscle in the first place, so any sort of accretion occurring within that muscle doesn't really make sense for our cohort. So anyway, in actuality, we use these anabolic androgenic ratings in rats to like determine what it's going to do in a human. And you take something like Trenbolone, which got 5 times more anabolic and 5 times more androgenic. This just is not reality when it comes to human use. In fact, quite far away from that. Trenbolone being a steroidal SARM, its divorce from androgenicity is pretty far. It's many times less androgenic than testosterone, about as anabolic, because all anabolic steroids are about as anabolic as each other in humans. There's no data.
You just opened up another can now, you see? That's you got a double whammy in this one.
That is another one. That's a pretty basic one, though. So like, understand that all steroids grow muscle at about the same rate as each other. There's no stronger than this or that. They all do about the same thing in humans. Primobolan, nandrolone, testosterone, masteron, they all grow muscle to about the same rate. When we discuss which is the right one, you look at kind of what else do they do when it comes to estrogen modulation, or how tissue selective they are, or whether you want more neurological input or whatever. It's definitely never anything to do with how much muscle they're going to accrue over time. So what trenbolone does do is it has a binding affinity for the glucocorticoid receptor, which is where cortisol binds, as many people listening to this will know. And cortisol plays a role in muscle protein breakdown. So trenbolone is excellent at turning down muscle protein breakdown, which is what makes it very suitable for fat loss phases, prep phases. But the dose required for this is very low. 1 milligram per kilogram per week is more than enough to achieve that goal. So in a 100-kilo male, if you're getting on stage with 225 pounds, you're a big person. And that's 100 milligram of trenbolone to really achieve that goal well. People consider trenbolone to be sort of very toxic and scary. I think it has problems. My biggest concern with trenbolone is neurotoxicity. However, arguably just as bad, if not in many pieces of data, worse is nandrolone. And people have no problem taking high dosages of nandrolone for long periods of time and being absolutely okay with this. I don't think that trenbolone is the devil, but I think it needs to be used responsibly like all other steroids. And I don't think that we can necessarily paint it as that much worse than nandrolone.
Yeah, I think alongside that conversation, Joe, the other thing that a lot of people misappropriate again is that certain milligrams are required for certain drugs in order for them to be quote unquote effective. And then first question is like, what kind of effect are we talking here? And if we're talking about the glucocorticoid receptor, like Joe mentioned, 1 milligram per kilogram, you've got that effectiveness, that efficacious doses now very low. But so you might hear say things like, you need to use at least 400 to 600 milligrams of primobolan in order for it to be effective. And you need to use this amount of this in order for it to be effective. And I think the problem lies with that particular statement is because most people are looking for the secondary side effect as a means to determine the success of that drug. So like if we take nandrolone, something that is fairly retentive, and you give somebody 200, 300 milligrams, they're going to get some retention from that 200 to 300 milligrams. And they're going to notice, oh, I'm muscularly fuller. I'm a little bit stronger. I feel great. Therefore, that drug is effective, tick, Whereas you take something like primobolan, it doesn't come with the retentive impact. The same amount of drug used, we both know, and we've just said that the relative protein accretion rate is fairly similar. However, the secondary side effect of muscular fullness and retention isn't noticed. So that person just immediately goes, that drug is terrible. It's why you'll hear people laugh and scoff at people using something like Masteron in the off season, because they're not getting weight on the scale immediately tomorrow. Therefore, they assume that drug is not doing what it's designed to do when in actual fact it is. So there's no minimum effective milligrams required for it to be effective for growth is what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Okay. And what about the idea that per milligram per kilogram, that whole model, that certain side effects, like with the likes of Tren, I think I've heard it bandied around, like 1 to 1.5 milligram per kilogram is when the side effects really start. Is there any sort of research behind that, or what's your thoughts on that?
So as a tissue selective drug, as the dose escalates, tissue selectivity decreases and you get off-target side effects would be the term I would use. So you're no longer selectively binding where you want it to be, and the risk of side effect is going to exponentially increase. It doesn't just linearly increase with these tissue selective drugs. It exponentially increases as the dose increases, but that goes for any single drug on the planet, not just trenbolone.
Yeah.
The risk of side effect and deleterious health concerns exponentially increases as you breach a certain milligram per kilogram, and it's a U-shape response.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Got you. Okay. So we can, we've put a lot of stuff to bed there, guys. Was there anything else? I know we threw the Tren stuff in there at the last, like that wasn't on the rota for today, I guess. But is there anything else you think that we said we could maybe go for another 15 minutes up to 5:30 here? So is there anything we haven't covered, or anything that you think we could enhance more on?
For hours. I'll give you a couple of growth hormone ones.
Go for it.
I'm trying to basically novice PD users. So growth hormone, maximum rates of free fatty acid mobilization have been well elucidated in literature. So this is a pretty good, handy one to use. So the ceiling dose of growth hormone for fatty acid mobilization appears to be around 1.5 units per 100 kilograms of body weight. It's a little bit less than that when injected intravenously, but on Physique Collective, I did a bit of a calculation to work out subcutaneous dosing. So using any more than that in a fat loss scenario per dose would be a bit of a waste of time. Then bodybuilders are inclined to say, well, I'll just use 1.5 units over and over again. Also, the environment of which you use growth hormone plays a large role in the rate of free fatty acid mobilization you're going to achieve. So if there's presence of amino acids or blood insulin or dietary fatty acids or glucose in the blood, your ability to mobilize fatty acids is destructively decreased. So using it in a fasted state in combination with some fat mobilizing activity, so walking, some kind of light cardio, cleaning the house, whatever, is a suitable deployment. Another one on growth hormone is maybe to put to bed the boom dosing thing, like 10 units every other day is better than 5 units a day, because that still goes on. I think that's a fair hypothesis to make if you're looking at systemic IGF-1, which is IGF-1 that's kicked out hepatically, or you could call it endocrine IGF-1, essentially IGF-1 everywhere. Per dose, that you're certainly going to get more of that. The issue with that being that that isn't the IGF-1 that's responsible for hypertrophy outcomes. Local autocrine and paracrine IGF-1 is. And systemic IGF-1 is a negative feedback regulator in some senses to local IGF-1. So boom dosing, you want to practically look on how can I keep systemic IGF-1 the lowest? And that would be by microdosing your growth hormone. So if you're going to use 3 units a day, a couple of 1.5 doses or 3 1-unit doses and splitting out that way is far more efficacious than 6 units every other day for hypertrophy.
Yeah. Awesome.
It's a quick growth hormone one. Also, here's another, let's just keep knocking out myths. Thyroid use, using T3 alone is not a suitable deployment. There's, so within the thyroidal axis, there's a negative feedback inhibitory system, just like the HPG axis. So if you take T3, your own endogenous thyroidal axis is now off for all intents and purposes. There are T4 dependent mechanisms that you will be turning off if you take T3 alone. So never use T3 without T4. And awesome. In many cases, T4 alone will be enough.
Okay. And yeah, I reckon I might have to get you on to talk all about thyroid again, Joe, because I've got Hashimoto, so that's a big thing for me. So I'm not on meds yet, so I'm not that into. I'm just trying to manage it before thyroid kicks the bucket with the antibodies. But I think we might get you on for a Hashimoto's and thyroid sort of episode as well after that.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think it's pretty cool to dig deep on thyroid and look at things like reverse T3 and T4, and in which individuals they would use a combination therapy versus a T4 only, and where the true replacement dosages are, and things may shock some people.
Yeah, awesome. Now, we're getting near to that time, boy, so I don't want to take any more of your day. I was about 5 minutes late and you gave me shit for it, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But, Joe, you did mention a few of the cartoon and different graphics that are on the Physique Collective site, so let's give a little plug for you and your Instagram and the website, obviously, then, if people didn't listen to the last episode and didn't get those links.
Yeah, so my members site is physiquecollective.com, and on there you've got myself and my team of coaches that produce content. So I handle all the performance enhancing drug discussion. We've got Matt on there that handles mindset. He does things like money management, how to set up morning routines, things like that. We've got Tom Evans on there that does a lot of cooking, recipe, stuff like that. So it's very much all inclusive. I've got a load of stuff on there for females specifically about tips to avoid and track virilization, for example. Today we've got a video coming out on how to monitor voice frequency over time. We've got loads on there. We've got a forum as well. The community is awesome. Dean's on there, log in his prep and whatnot. It's absolutely awesome. It's £6.99 a month, so it's pretty bloody cheap. And just watch all the videos and cancel if you want. That's sound. Yeah. Ultimately, it's not a money grab when you look at how much it is and how many people are contributing. It just about keeps us afloat. It's a passion project for me. So there's that. That's physiquecollective.com. What's on my Instagram? To be honest, on my Instagram, you're not going to see much educational stuff. It's just client photos. But if you like that kind of thing, or dog stuff, lots of dog stuff on there as well, is Joe_Physique Collective. Yeah.
Awesome. And Dean, what about you? How can the guys hit you up? You've obviously been on 2 episodes that have been in the top 5, actually. So you're well known, but if anyone doesn't follow you, mate, how can they get in touch?
Yeah, easiest place for us is just to head to the main business page, which is Flex Success or Flex_Success on Instagram. We have a bunch of quick links on there for all of the things that we offer. So we've got, online consultations, one-on-one coaching is our bread and butter. And then we also have like a little bit of a semi-private group that I run as well for people that are a little bit more self-sufficient and just really need prescription without education at a lower cost, So yeah, that's the easiest place to find us. All of our services are on there. There's myself, Liz, my partner, both in business and in life. And then our 2 coaches, Chelsea and Tom, are on there. So we all have our own like sort of little demographic or avatar, I suppose you could say, of clientele that we prefer to work with. Myself being contest prep specific, Liz being general population, Tom being general population plus, like say, performance athletes, specifically around either hybrid athlete or powerlifting. And then Chelsea will do a blend between general population and also like female physique contest preparation, but not enhanced.
Okay, cool. And Dean, how did the potato book go that we were speaking about in the last episode?
It's going well. I'm still waiting on people. I've only had one person tag us in it because there's a hilarious part in it in regards to the artist that I told you about.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, it's going well. It's actually been a good heap amount of copies sold. So if anyone listens to this podcast and they have purchased it, we'd love a tag and a share on IG if they've got it. Especially if it's the potato chapter, just for a laugh.
I'm actually going to be a good friend and go and buy it because I've been a shit friend. I told you last time I was going to buy it and I haven't done it. So I'm gonna flip that round and stop being a shit mate and go and order it.
Yeah, sounds good.
But guys, thank you for this. No doubt people will have enjoyed this. So guys, if you have, please tag us all in it. Let us know you've enjoyed it. This has been like well received. All the episodes that you guys have done have been well over 200 listens, like pretty much instantly. So yeah, I think this will go down really well. And guys, tag us, let us know what you think, and we will see you on the next episode. Thanks, Dean. Thanks, Joe.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode of The O Show. If you know somebody who needs to hear this episode today, please share this with them via message or on social media. Don't forget to also take a screenshot and share it on your story and tag me at Oren McCarry so we can continue to grow the podcast and help more people change their lives with the advice given here. Also, keep the 5-star reviews coming over on iTunes, as that helps people who normally wouldn't listen to the show find it and get the O Show in their ears and drive the podcast forward to help more people around the world with the advice here. Have a great day, and I will speak to you soon.